Hey everyone, we've got an awesome, fantastic show coming up for you today. I've got Ben Armstrong from Microsoft coming on the show to talk about Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI. So we're going to talk about what it is, why it's important for IT pros, and lots more. In fact, we even delved into the Hyper-V territory as well. The episode, when we recorded, ended up being more than an hour long. So we're kind of deviating from our standard format here, and we're going to break this one up into two separate episodes. So this episode you're going to consume today focuses on the Azure Kubernetes Service bit on top of, again, Azure Stack HCI. And then in next week's episode, we're going to talk about what's new in Hyper-V and what's going on with Hyper-V Server. All coming up next on the Dojo Podcast. Well, everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Dojo Podcast, the podcast designed to help you become the kick-ass system administrator within your organization. My name is Andy Serwich, your host, and I'm really excited about today's episode. So I've got Ben Armstrong from Microsoft on the line today. How's it going, my friend?
It is going great, and I'm super happy to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. We always have great conversations, Ben, so we always like to have you on videos, podcasts, webinars. Anytime we can have you on some type of show, we love to have you. So for those watching that may not be familiar with you, can you kind of tell us who you are and what you do for Microsoft?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Ben Armstrong. My current title is I'm a group program manager for AKS on-premises, which is the team that's delivering Azure Kubernetes Service anywhere in your data center that you need it. But I've been at Microsoft almost 20 years. I'm coming up on my 20-year in fairly soon, actually. And that entire 20 years, I have been program management on virtualization technology. So I started out working on virtual PC for Windows. I then worked on virtual server. I was then key part of the team that developed and bootstrapped Hyper-V. And a lot of folk know me as the guy who ran the ship for Hyper-V for years and years and years. I was actually not a lot of people know that I was actually the program manager in charge of bootstrapping Windows containers. I handed that off to my good colleague Taylor Brown when it got to the beta release, so that I could return to working on Hyper-V. And a couple of years ago, I went back to the container world and I started heading up the efforts to take all the work that we're doing in Azure with Azure Kubernetes Service and bring it to people's data centers so that they can do cool things with containers there. So that's the brain dump.
Nice. So has it really been a couple of years you've been on AKS now? I feel like it was...
Yeah.
Man, COVID has just destroyed all semblance of time.
Yes. Yeah. No, tell me. Now, I will say, in your defense, there was a good year or two at the beginning before we announced that we were doing anything with AKS on premises, right, where I was faking still being on Hyper-V. There were a couple of events where I had spent the last year of my life doing Kubernetes stuff, and they were like, Ben, you got to come here and talk about Hyper-V and so on. I was like, fine. So it's been about a year and a half that I've been publicly talking about, hey, I'm working on AKS on premises.
Gotcha. Okay, so our readership, our viewers, our audience tends to be more in the IT pro, the system administrator realm, the guys that are in the trenches day in and day out, supporting their businesses, SMB, SME, some enterprise, right? And there's a lot of admins in that space that are still kind of trying to wrap their heads around containers. They're still getting into the container world, right? With that in mind, can you kind of give us just a quick overview of what AKS is?
Yeah, absolutely. So first let me give a very simple description of Kubernetes, and then kind of into AKS, and then into AKS on premises.
Makes sense.
So a while ago now, it was 6-7 years ago, that the industry started thinking about containers and started, thinking about, hey, we're doing all this real cool stuff with virtual machines, but is there a way that we can do it more efficiently? Is there a way that we can do it with less need for system administration and so on? And that started down the direction of containers. And while containers by themselves are a really cool concept, any system administrator knows that like there's the system and then there's all the infrastructure to allow you to run it in production.
Yep.
And that's really what Kubernetes is. You have your app running in a container, but you need something to make sure that it's always running, to make sure that you have high availability, that you have failover, that it has the resources that it needs, that you have the information. You need all that orchestration and management. And that's really where Kubernetes comes in. And Kubernetes, it's a great open source project, lots of contributors, and the industry as a whole is really rallying behind it. Now, I'm not going to be surprising or offending anyone when I say this. The problem with Kubernetes is it is mind-blowingly complicated.
It really is.
It is really like, and for a reason, it is solving hard problems.
Right.
Like it is solving hard problems and it is solving them well, but in doing that, it is very complicated. And so a number of years ago now, it was actually, we originally launched AKS in Azure in late 2017, early 2018. And with AKS, what we did was we said, hey, you have workloads that you running containers or that you have running in containers. You want to use Kubernetes because it's a good orchestration engine, but you don't want to have to get your hands dirty and deal with the nitty gritty. That's what AKS does. And you can come to Azure and you can say, give me a Kubernetes server. Not only do we handle all the provisioning and the managing and so on for you, but we also make sure that we're following security best practices and things that are patched and up to date so that people can come to Azure and say, just give me a Kubernetes server. And they just have to deal with the top edge.
So you kind of done with AKS what you guys did with SQL, right? If I just want to consume a SQL database, I just go out to Azure and say, give me Azure SQL, right? And here's your database.
Yeah, 100%.
Nice.
And so what we're doing with AKS on premises is then actually really interesting, because what we're doing is, on one hand, we are trying to give you something that you can run in your data center on your hardware. On the other hand, we are trying to give you the ease of managed service that you get with AKS. And so we don't want our users to have to know all the guts of how you set up AKS on Azure Stack HCI, for example. You go through, it's a fairly typical setup process. And when it's all set up, you can just go I want a new Kubernetes cluster and I want it to have this many Linux nodes and this many Windows nodes. And we set it up for you. You don't have to install Linux. You don't have to install Windows. You don't have to do any other Kubernetes setup. You don't have to, we do that all for you. And we just at the end go here's a Kubernetes server, deploy some containers to it.
That's really nice, because I know every time I've looked at Kubernetes and every time I've deployed it, I've had to redeploy Kubernetes clusters a couple of times, thankfully not in production. But you would think with most services, I've actually been able to remember the deployment mechanisms and the steps. With Kubernetes, it's just no, I need to have the documentation up on my second monitor and go through it step by step, no matter how many times I've done it, right?
It's one of the things that I joke about is that when I'm out talking to folk about AKS on Azure Stack HCI, or we now also have AKS on Azure Stack Hub, and people are kind of going okay, what's the value here? One of the things I talk about with it being this managed service is I'm So we push out an update every month. The update has features, it has new Kubernetes versions, but it also has security patches.
Right.
And so you use AKS on-prem. You say like, I want a Kubernetes cluster with like Windows nodes and Linux nodes and so on. Uh, and that thing is combined of multiple operating systems and like dozens and dozens of open source projects. Uh, and we are constantly monitoring all of those for any security issues. And every month we pull in the latest patches, we validate them, we roll them in. And you as the user get to just go like, oh, apply the monthly update and you're covered. And I tell people that when I tell that story, I can always tell the level of experience that people have had. Because if it's someone who's like just read about Kubernetes and maybe like done a class or two, they're like, oh yeah, okay, that sounds good. Whereas if there's someone who's actually tried to do Kubernetes in production themselves, they're like, wait, what? Really? Like, here's our money. Take it. Like, I don't want to have to deal with that.
Right. Yep. I mean, that's tremendous value because I've talked to guys that have been running fairly large Kubernetes deployments in-house, and the support nightmares I hear about, and they just spend hours and hours managing and maintaining and patching. And so sounds like basically in a nutshell, what you guys are doing is you're giving users the power of Kubernetes and everything that comes along with it without the management headaches, right? Is essentially what the goal is.
100%. 100%.
Gotcha. Because that's one thing I've always seen with Kubernetes is the point of entry is a fairly that's not a word, fairly steep learning curve, right? And it sounds like you guys have eliminated that, which is fantastic. So it sounds like a really exciting project. What I want to do real quick is just kind of, so we talked about what AKS is, talked about running it on premises, right? Which one thing I want to clarify really quick about that is it needs to run in Azure Stack HCI on premises, right? Or Azure Stack Hub you mentioned as well too, right?
So we actually, so right now we have AKS on Azure Stack HCI. We have AKS on Azure Stack Hub. Now AKS on Azure Stack HCI is also supported on Windows Server 2019.
Gotcha.
And we're talking about like trying to make some more noise and attention around that. So if you're listening to this and you have a Windows Server 2019 cluster running Hyper-V, and you're interested in trying out AKS and you're not yet ready to upgrade to Azure Stack HCI, go for it. Fully supported. We deliver the same experience there.
Nice. That's a big deal. Okay. One thing I want to do really quick is step back a little bit and kind of talk about the larger container ecosystem and use case. Because when I talk to IT pros and we start having this conversation about containers and virtual machines, because they always get compared to each other, right? A lot of questions that I'm still hearing today, all these years later, is like, well, hey, I've got all my virtual machines in my cluster over here, and they've been running for years, and I know how to manage it, and I'm happy with it. What's the value add for that system administrator who isn't convinced yet when they're looking at containers? What's the use case for them?
Yeah, so there are kind of three stories that I have here that these are stories that I hear today, and trust me, we're working on building more. Like we have a bold vision for the future. But what do I hear today? So the first story that I hear is, and I love this story because this kind of leans into a bit of my history of working on Hyper-V. So when I was working on Hyper-V, I'd frequently go out and do site visits with customers, and I would chat to customers running their infrastructure. And I'd sit down and I'd be like, "Tell me about your environment." People would be like super excited to be like, here's all the hardware we have, and here's how the networking's set up, and here's how the storage is set up, and here's how the environment's set up. And the punchline that they would get to is they would always get to like, and with all of this, like, we provide our company the ability to run like 10,000 virtual machines.
There's always a punchline.
And they would get there, and I'd be like, okay, great. Of those 10,000 virtual machines, what do you think the divide is? Windows, Linux. And different people would come back with different, like, some people would be like, it's 70% Linux, 30% Windows. Some people would be 50-50. Some people would be like, it's 30% Linux, 70% Windows. And I would say, okay, great. Like, what are you doing with the Windows VMs? And it would be like, well, like, we got a bunch of SQL, got some Exchange, got some SharePoint, got a bunch of file servers. Oh my God, so many file servers. We do a bit of VDI, and like all of that conversation. And then I go, okay, what are you doing with your Linux VMs? And I'd say, I don't know. I'd be like, wait, no, seriously. Like, I know I'm the Microsoft guy. You can tell me, what are you doing with the Linux VMs?
Not going to hurt any feelings, right?
And they'd be like, I don't know. And I'd be like, what? And they're like, well, here at like company XYZ, you're talking to the infrastructure people. We have this dirty, smelly group of developers. I don't like them. But they come to me and they say, I want some Linux VMs, and I give them Linux VMs and they go away.
Right.
And I'd hear that story over and over. And well, of course, we know that what's been happening is those developers have been off playing with containers. And they've been building new solutions in containers. And what's happened in a lot of companies is like the developers like started getting stuff running in containers. And then they're like, oh, like you can't do production containers on raw VMs. You need something else. Like, right. Oh, you need this Kubernetes. And so the developers start playing with Kubernetes. And it doesn't take them long until they're like, okay, this is exactly what we need, but this is hard.
Right.
And this is infrastructure. I'm not an infrastructure person. I'm a developer. And so then what we have is in these companies, we have the developers coming back to the infrastructure people and going, hey, infrastructure guys, like you've been giving us Linux VMs. And infrastructure people are like, yeah, you love your Linux VMs. And they're like, we don't want Linux VMs anymore. We want Kubernetes.
Right.
To which the infrastructure people go, Kuber what?
Kuber huh? Who?
and the developers are like, Kubernetes, it's great. Like, let's do a brown bag. And they do this whole brown bag, and the infrastructure people are like, wait a second, this is Linux, this is you. They're like, no. It's infrastructure, it's you.
Right.
And and I gotta tell you, like some of the saddest customer stories I have heard over the last couple of years is companies that have got to that stage, and what's happened is the developers have gone like, tell you what, we'll just give you this Kubernetes deployment that we did not following any of the best practices or security guidelines, you just have to keep it running. Okay, dev out.
Oh boy, nothing wrong there, right?
So that's the first dynamic that we see, that we're like, we are here to help.
Right.
Like if you have devs who want a Kubernetes, but like you're used to Azure, you're used to Windows Server, we can give you an experience where it's going to work for you. You can focus on what you need to focus on. Devs can be happy. Like everything, like world peace and harmony. So that's the first scenario that we see. The second scenario that we see, this is really interesting and really fun, is if you've been around Microsoft at all over the last decade, you might know that we happen to think that public cloud is pretty cool.
Just a
and
bit. Yep.
we think that Azure is pretty cool. And we've been out working with our customers and saying like, hey, if you can do stuff in Azure, you should like try and do stuff in Azure.
Right.
And so we have a bunch of companies where about 5-6 years ago, they hit a point where they're like, you know what, Microsoft, we agree. Like public cloud is pretty cool. And they're like, we have a bunch of stuff that is running in our data centers. We're just going to kind of maintain that. And we're going to start building new stuff in public cloud. They've been doing that, and they've been doing that, and they've been doing that. But it's now 5-6 years later, and they're going like, wait a second. I have like aging infrastructure on-prem.
Nope.
But I still have business problems I need to solve on-prem. Like there are new business problems that I have where like it doesn't make sense for that to be running in the public cloud because maybe it's interacting with like sensors or cameras that are local. Maybe I have a big local database. Maybe
Right.
I have maybe I have like legacy storage that I need to like a million like reasons where it's like I need to build a new app, but it's going to run in my data center.
Right.
And for those companies, they're going like, our dev teams only know how to build cloud apps.
Right.
Like, it's all they've been doing for the last 5-6 years. And if I go to them and say like, I need a new like point of sale app that runs in our store, because it needs to keep on running if the internet's down.
Right.
Like they'll look at me like I don't know what you're talking about. And so with AKS on-prem, we get to say like, hey, you can build your new line of business app as a cloud native app, and you can run it in your store on a 2-node cluster, and it'll keep on running if the internet goes down. So that's kind of the second story that we're seeing.
Right. So
Now,
for the dev team in that situation, it doesn't matter where the app lives, their development process is the same.
yeah.
Yep.
Now, both of those stories are very much stories for you have a dev team
Right.
who's building stuff.
Yep.
Which then leads to the question of like, okay, well, what if I don't have a dev team?
Yep. I run into that question quite frequently.
And the short answer to that is, it's okay. I'm Microsoft. We have a dev team building stuff.
Right. Right.
And so this is where, and this is like, we're kind of early days right now, but I can assure you there's a lot more coming, where we are working on building a lot of new offerings for Arc-enabled services, where like, my favorite example of this is Arc-enabled data services.
Okay.
Where you don't have to know about containers. You don't have to know about Kubernetes. You don't have to know any of that stuff. If you have an existing SQL server that's chugging along, but it's getting towards the end of its life, get a new Azure Stack HCI cluster, 2-node cluster, put AKS on that, put Arc-enabled data services on that. That's going to give you SQL managed instances where you can have it come in and take on the role of your existing SQL servers. But on top of that, you now get like full Azure integration and monitoring. You can monitor that through the Azure portal from wherever you're at. You can use Azure Defender on that system. You can use Azure Policy on that system. You can, this is actually one of the really cool things is you can, with Arc-enabled data services, give different people in your organization the ability to create and destroy their own SQL database instances, like their own SQL servers. You can go because I don't care whether you have developers or not. Everyone has an annoying person in their org who wants to do stuff with the SQL database that they should.
There's always a DBA like that. That's for sure. There's always a DBA.
That is the constant of life. But that's just one example. We are working on a number of new Arc-enabled services, which is going to be about allowing people who don't have their own development orgs to take advantage of new on-prem offerings from Microsoft that utilize containers and Kubernetes under the covers to get density, scale, elasticity.
Nice. That's a good point. So I like how you put it initially, like, well, maybe you don't have a dev team, but we do, right?
We do.
And so now if I'm the administrator for an SMB or an SME, right, I don't have a dev team, I can still get some of the benefits ultimately once a lot of these services start coming out.
Absolutely.
I get all the benefits of AKS and all of the technologies, and I'm going to use a Microsoft word here, the learnings, right?
Yeah.
Underneath the building AKS, while leveraging other Microsoft services, which sign me up.
I will say on the learnings, it is I cause a lot of grief from my user experience team. Because I simultaneously set them two challenges, which they're often grumpy at me about. Where I go, on one hand, when I think about the user experience for AKS on-prem, I want to make sure that if you're a Windows Server admin and you're used to Windows Server admin tools, I want you to feel at home with AKS on-prem. And we have a great experience through Windows Admin Center. We have a great PowerShell experience where it's I want you to just feel at home and
nice.
This is where you should be. On the other hand, one of the things that I also talk about a lot is I want to make sure that as you're using AKS on Azure Stack HCI through these tools, that anything that you're learning makes you a better AKS admin in Azure.
That's a good point.
That learning to be 100% transferable. If someone only their first experience of AKS is running on Azure Stack HCI, and then in a year's time their CIO is can we do this in Azure? I don't want them to have to learn anything new, because I want that and I'm really pedantic with the team where I'm I want PowerShell commands to look the same. I want the terms to be the same. I want the concepts to be the same, so that as you're learning, it just transfers back and forth.
That's a great stance, though, because reskilling has historically been a huge problem in the industry, right? So
100%.
Yeah, that's great. So I've used AKS myself in Azure Stack HCI, but I've never used it in Azure, right? So that's sounds like I'd be all set, if I'm comfortable on-prem.
Yes.
And that's great. Yeah. That's great. Very cool. I was not aware of that. So that's my something learned today. So very cool.
Awesome.
All right. So moving on to the next question on our list here, and I've had some conversation with some other Microsoft MVPs on this particular topic, and when we start talking about containers and Kubernetes, eventually we always end up somehow talking about serverless compute, or in the Microsoft stack, that would be Azure Functions, right?
Yep.
So is there any concern with Azure Functions eventually overtaking containers as the deployment methodology? I know from where I sit, the benefit of containerization over serverless is if I build an application on serverless on Azure Functions, I'm kind of married to that platform, right? I'm not going to be moving that application around a whole lot after it's already there. Whereas with containers, if I want to run it in my data center, I run it in my data center. If I want to run it in Azure, I run it in Azure. If I want to colo it somewhere, I can move it over there, right? That's kind of what the big difference is, at least from my chair. I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on that.
yeah, this is I have a lot of thoughts on this. Uh, so the first one to answer is, do I have any concerns? No, I do not. Um, because I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that, like, hi, I've been working in virtualization for
Right.
like 20 years and so on. And one of the things, and a lot of people would find this depressing, but thankfully that's not the way my brain is wired. I find this kind of cool. One of the things when I chat to folk about is I go like, if I take a step back and look at everything that I've worked on and everything that I've done, um, there is a lens where I can look at my life and go, I have spent the last 20 years just trying to make it easier for people to deploy and manage server applications.
Right. Right.
Like, that is all I've done. Like, the technology has changed, but that's the core problem that I'm trying to solve. And it's one of the things that kind of makes me chuckle, like when we talk about like Kubernetes being complicated, which,
Right.
like, don't get me wrong, like, Kubernetes is complicated. I would challenge you to try and do even half the things that people are trying to do with Kubernetes without any virtualization technology at all.
Right.
It's like, you
Yep.
think this is complicated? Try and do this all in bare metal in a data center. Because like I chat, I'm like the old guy on the team these days, but like I chat to like new hires, and I'm like, you have to understand that when I started in the industry, um, if you were a developer working at an enterprise company and you said, I need a web server, like, minimum 6 weeks.
Minimum. That's assuming
Because
you
like,
get the
and that's
hardware, right?
like 6 weeks is assuming you already have your business approval sorted out. Like, if your business, like, if you are working on a project that already has business approval and you're like, oh, I need another web server, that would go to the IT person who would have to order the hardware. The hardware would have to get shipped to the company. It had to get racked. It would have to get provisioned. It would have to get wired up. Someone would have miscalculated the switch. That would be wrong. You would lose a week trying to figure that out. Someone would get the VLAN routing on the port wrong. 6 weeks. It was like that,
Yep.
you know? And so there's this part of me that's like, when I'm talking with customers, where it's like, oh yeah, like on this 2-node customer cluster, we're running 130 applications, and they're like, and we're using a service mesh to keep their networks isolated from each other. So it's these, and I'm just like, this fantasy land. Like, if you went to like me starting in my career and talked about this, like, this is fantasy land.
That's a good point.
So
That's a very that perspective that just kind of, yeah, that frames
yeah.
it well. Agreed.
and so with that perspective, like, do I like one way to interpret your question is to say, do I view containers running on Kubernetes as the end of the journey? Hell no. Like,
Right.
it's the next step in the journey. And
Right.
I'm excited. I don't know what the next step is going to be. There's a lot of interesting technology going on right now where, like, yeah, it's going to be really exciting. Um, Now, with that perspective, I do get a lot of folk talking to me about serverless and what serverless means on the edge. And I do kind of tease this apart because there are actually two aspects of serverless. Uh, the one of which really can't come to the edge, and one of which can. Uh, so the first aspect of serverless is when you're a hyperscale cloud, like when you're a hyperscale cloud like Azure. Um, Part of the conversation around serverless is we have a conversation with you where we say, like, hey Andy, like, if you will just give up a little bit of control and not care about the details of the size of the VM or like how much memory or so on. If you will just give us an app and say, Microsoft, just like have this app running somewhere. I don't care where, as long as it's running. Like we have enough like scheduling gaps in all of our all our literally millions of servers,
right?
That giving us that freedom allows us to lower the cost of running your app and pass that saving on to you. So there's this hyperscale aspect of like, hey, if you can trust us to like pack your app in the right place, our data center wide scheduler can be that much more efficient that we can lower the cost for everyone. That doesn't translate if we're talking about 4 servers that are running. Like there's serverless and there's like, you can see the servers and there's 4 of them.
Right. Yep.
Like, it doesn't matter how efficiently we pack your apps. There's 4 servers and there's only so much you can run.
We can confirm there are servers, but it's serverless, right?
Yeah. So that aspect of serverless doesn't translate out.
Yeah, makes sense.
The aspect of serverless that does translate out is, I mean, first, like there's a, like as someone who's like spent a good chunk of my life working on the core fabric of Azure. Yeah, we got a couple of servers for that serverless thing.
Just a few.
And there's a lot of operating system software running between your app and those servers to deliver serverless. And so really what serverless means is you don't have to think about the servers.
Right.
You just think about your application.
Yep.
And on that front, like I have a personal goal, and it's something that I push the team on, where it's like, I would love to be in a, like, my dream world is I would love to be in a world where I could have a customer go, I want to run these apps on AKS in my data center. And I could go like, okay, you go to this portal, you hit this button, we give you a USB stick, you stick it in that machine and hit it on. And that is all you have to think about.
That'd be pretty nice.
Because I like that machine's going to come up and we're going to deploy an OS to it and we're going to manage it and we're going to connect it to Arc and all the stuff, and we're going to set up AKS and we're going to deploy your app, and it's going to be your machine and it's going to be in your data center, and you are fully capable of going and tinkering with it and seeing it and doing whatever you want, but you don't have to. To me, that is what serverless on-prem would actually mean. It would mean not having to deal with server management yourself.
See, that's nice because you've got that subset of administrators that even to this day, after years and years and years of Microsoft fostering trust and goodwill with the public cloud, you still have this shrinking community of IT pros that you're going to pry their servers out of their cold, dead hands, you know? And I mean, to me, this checks 2 boxes. One, it checks the box of that administrator that says, hey, I have this application. It just needs to be running. My users need to be able to get to it. Put the USB stick in, like you said, click go, done. But you're also catering to that other type of administrator that they want to be able to walk in their server room and, okay, my application's running on this machine right here, and they feel all warm and fuzzy, and they can turn dials and push sliders up and down, and they got the bells and whistles there if they want them.
Yeah, and to me that is the vision at the end of the day. Like,
right.
we got some work to get there, but I do, like, one day I do want to say that we are doing serverless on-prem.
Nice. Very cool. Very cool. Exciting times, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one last question I want to ask on the containerization bit, and then I'm going to pivot to Hyper-V a little bit because, again, you are known as Mr. Hyper-V in circles, right?
Always happy to chat about Hyper-V.
I figured you would be. But before I get there, one last thing I want to ask about containerization is just about adoption. And I know you probably can't share specific numbers, but at least from where I sit in the industry, it seems like adoption of just containers in general, whether that's Windows containers on Windows Server or whether that's through AKS, or it just seems like adoption is kind of exploding, right? Is there any, like I said, I know you can't give specific numbers, but is there any kind of, just experiences or thoughts that you can give on that just to kind of showcase how big this sector is growing?
Yeah. First, I'll do. I always love to be my historian and give my historic response. So hopefully many of your viewers know who Jeff Woolsey is, another great program manager on the Windows Server team. He and I actually worked at the same startup company that got acquired by Microsoft for virtualization.
I didn't know that.
So
interesting.
Yeah, we both worked at Connectix. Both worked on virtual PC. In fact, when the virtualization team started, we had 3 program managers, and Jeff and I were 2 of the 3.
Nice.
But one of the things that Jeff and I often remark on is, how much similarity we see between the market adoption of containers and the market adoption of virtual machines, because a lot of the folk who are listening to this will have got into virtual machines when they had their explosion moment,
right?
And for most people, virtual machines became mainstream somewhere around 2008 to 2012.
Right.
In kind of that window. And it's we started doing virtual machines in 2001.
Okay. Yep.
We were doing virtual machines for 7-8 years before we started to see, and there's a lot of things where it's people when we start doing containers and people are I was good for dev and test. I'm yeah, that's where virtual machines were. I remember 2004, 2005. That's all that people were using it for. And so there's a lot of similar patterns going on there. One of the there are, when it comes to what, and you're absolutely right that we are right on that moment where my expectation is that in the next 2 to 3 years, we're just going containers are going to take over the world.
Right.
And 2 of the data points that I do have, one which is a very hard and easy data point, and the other which is more anecdotal. The very hard and easy one is AKS is the fastest growing service in Azure. Full stop.
Really?
Full stop.
Okay, very cool.
It is, and trust me, that is, there's a lot of bragging rights in that gets tracked and monitored very closely. AKS is the fastest growing service in Azure right now. So that's awesome.
Wow. Yeah, yes, very cool.
Yeah. Going absolutely gangbusters there. But the second one, which is a really fundamental one, is that for the last 3 years, all enterprise application development has either happened in the cloud or in containers.
Right.
I challenge you to find someone who is writing a new enterprise app today and is going, nah, I'm doing it in a VM.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. Because developers don't want to manage the OS, right?
Yeah.
They just want the
Yeah.
container image.
And so you kind of like where the developers are today is where the infrastructure will be in a couple of years' time. Like, yeah, there is lag, but we are absolutely seeing that right now today. Any developer at any enterprise who is writing a new app is doing it in containers. And so that gives us a lot of confidence that it's like, yeah, and that's where like our focus is, that as that wave comes in, we want to give the best infrastructure to people to be able to run.
Gotcha. Yeah, those are both pretty. I mean, both of those data points paint a pretty clear picture there, don't they? That the service is growing and it's not going anywhere. So that's very cool. Hey, thanks for listening, everyone. Again, kind of deviating from our standard format today again, right? And, we've talked for 40, 50 minutes there on Azure Kubernetes Service on top of Azure Stack HCI. I hope you guys found it enlightening and interesting, and hopefully you got excited about what's coming next with this service in the industry, right? So with that, again, kind of a reminder, we're going to be doing part 2 of this series with Ben next week. So again, we're going to focus on Hyper-V, what's new there, what Ben's excited about. We're going to talk a little bit about Hyper-V Server and what's going on with that SKU of Windows Server. And again, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all of our other educational contents out on the Altero Dojo. Again, that's www.altero.com/dojo. Pick your poison, and you can consume VMware content, Hyper-V content, M365 content, backup and DR content, MSP content. Again, we've got lots out there for you to check out and enjoy. And with that, thanks for watching today's episode. We'll be back next week with Ben. We hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, it's Andy again. Hey, thanks for watching the episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to leave you with, we've been talking a lot about Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V, hybrid cloud, and a lot of the recent episodes. Wanted to let you know that on March 23rd, we are running a webinar that talks about all things Azure Stack HCI and hybrid cloud. Now, you can register for that webinar by clicking on the link in the description of this episode. And if you're watching or listening to this episode after March 23rd, you can use that same link to watch the webinar on demand. So hope you enjoy it. Again, we hope to see you for a future episode of the podcast. Have a great day.